All right, nation. So you guys asked for it, and it's time. It is time. This is a part of our learning journey that we're starting right now. It is time for me to teach you what I've learned about Grimdark. And so I have prepared you the Grimdark 101 PowerPoint presentation. It's OP, it's down to the point, and it's damn good. It's damn good. Trust me. I'm not biased. I just made it. I'm biased, but it's good. It's a good PowerPoint. It's going to answer all your questions. And I can basically guarantee you, as long as you approach this with an open mind and understand this is my opinion, this is my perspective, this is the knowledge that I've gained from painting Grimdark almost exclusively for about a year and a half, studying others. If you're open-minded to that perspective, I think you're going to walk out of this learning something. So let's get into it. Presenting the PowerPoint. Ta-da! Look at that. Look at it in all its glory. So, grab a seat, sit down, and let Sauce tell you about Grimdark. You guys ready? Grimdark 101. An introduction to painting Grimdark. Now, I will say there's possibly some errors in here, spelling-wise. Don't judge me. I don't know. Maybe we'll find out. We'll see if anybody finds stuff. I don't know. An important part of getting into Grimdark painting and our Grimdark painting series that we'll be doing on YouTube in the coming weeks is to understand the fundamentals and the beginnings of Grimdark. For me, if you want to understand a topic, you need to go to the very beginning. And to understand and be a part of painting Grimdark Marines, you need to understand what is Grimdark. And that's what this PowerPoint is dedicated to, is building some fundamental knowledge as well as a brief introduction into painting styles, tools, techniques, and all of those things along the way. These topics will be expanded on greatly in the coming videos and series. But before we get into those, we need a common understanding of what Grimdark is, in my opinion, and others, based on mine and collective experience. What is Grimdark? What a great question. We're here to answer that today. Right now, we're going to get to the bottom of what is Grimdark. And there's no better way to get to the bottom of it than literally Googling, what is Grimdark? There you go. Grimdark is a noun, actually, it turns out. A genre of fiction, especially fantasy fiction, characterized by disturbing, violent, or bleak subject matter in a dystopian setting. GG's, right? Right? This is just straight up copy paste screenshot right off of Google. Thank you. Thanks for the content, Google. Or it's also an adjective. Characterized by disturbing, violent, bleak subject matter and dystopian setting. I don't know enough about English to know the difference between choosing to use it as a noun or an adjective, but it's the same goddamn thing. Same thing. Same thing. But more importantly, though, I went to the experts and I just asked my friends on Instagram. I said, hey, what does Grimdark mean to you? And these are some of the bullet points that they said. And I think it's really important to cover these together. A lot of the common themes from these are listed right here. So a model that's been interacted with its environment. It's heavily weathered, impacted. It's been around. I think that that's a really, really common theme that you see in Grimdark painting, is that it lives in its environment. It's been there. It's a part of it. The environment lives on it. It lives in the environment. They all work together. Another common theme that we see is misery, hopelessness, and the ominous, right? This feeling of being stuck somewhere. It's hopeless. They're there forever. They're on this mission and they're not getting saved. They're just there to fight it out until the very end. This is another common theme that you see among Grimdark. It's a hopeless scene. It really is. War is hopeless. It's brutal, and it should be conveyed that way. Dirt and grit. Yep. Oh yeah. If you're stuck out in the shit, you're stuck in the shit pit. Guess what? You're covered in dirt and grit. You're going to be, again, a part of your environment. Your environment lives on it. Models need to interact with the environment that they're a part of. And that's another common theme that we see inside of Grimdark. To thrive is to stay alive. This was a good one. That like helps you understand the aesthetic. Like the part that like, there's a part of Grimdark that lives inside of your gut almost, where you're like, oh, it's heartbreaking. It's wrenching, you know? And like, to literally to thrive in this environment, to thrive, to live your best life in 40K, for example, all you're trying to do is just stay alive. That's how hopeless, that's how depressing and heartache these people go through in their everyday lives. And thriving is literally living. It's a bleak, horrible, brutal state to be in. We're also going to sometimes see conflicting agendas among the characters and the miniatures involved. Sometimes their stories don't all work together, and they might go after each other. They might not all be allies. They might be on the surface, but behind they might have secret agendas. And these are the things that add development, plot, depth to the story of the characters and the miniatures that we're painting. Approaching painting through a storyteller's agenda. The 5 W's. You guys all know the 5 W's, right? Who, what, where, wow, how, wow, wins. All that stuff is important. And being able to tell a story through the eyes of your miniature. Being able to tell a story by just taking a snapshot of the miniature and making your viewer be able to see what you're trying to portray is a very important part of Grimdark. So big shout out to my boys Mappo, Grimbo, Jono, and Immersive Craft Worlds. Or Immersive World Crafter. Sorry. Classic. Classic Sauce Can't Read blooper. It's always super interesting. I think that's one of the most important parts of Grimdark painting is that everybody has a different perspective on it. So many people approach it differently, but you're going to see common themes when you ask Grimdark painters and people, what is Grimdark to you? And I think that a lot of these themes will show up when you talk to more people. The more Grimdark people you talk to, you might have people starting to say, you know, the same thing in different ways, but this is kind of the same thing that they're going to be talking about. These are the same ideas, concepts that you're going to see repeatedly throughout Grimdark work. Even further down the same what is Grimdark rabbit hole, according to me, some dummy from Instagram, I love to sum up Grimdark with just a couple of words. I think for me, the first word is atmosphere. Atmosphere is such an important feeling to understand. And when I say atmosphere, I think it's what's happening around the miniature. What is it about the miniature and what's happening to it? What is the atmosphere? Truly, like if you think about painting a miniature, I think about like if I literally just took this miniature out of the ground, like bloop, it's out of the ground for this 1 second, you know, like here's this almost like it's like I cut out the planet around it and just removed the entire chunk. Here's the model. Here's the planet that it's on. It's now out. That's atmosphere. What does everything feel like around it? What is the feelings, the emotions that go into it? And that is atmosphere to me. Atmosphere to me is the most important word to describe Grimdark. But a close runner up to that is realism. Realism is tied so hand in hand with atmosphere, with Grimdark, and it's portraying again the storytelling, the environment, showing the bleak hopelessness, you know, that these miniatures are experiencing in this fantasy world. It's a part of realism. We also see miniatures typically being heavily impacted and even mentally by the environment around the model. You know, you see these, you've seen some insane conversions of miniatures that are just, you know, maybe I've seen conversions of a Space Marine backed up against the wall without a helmet on and his arm is blown off and he's just sitting there and you're like, oh my God, like you can almost feel his emotions in the piece. And that's what I really like, is the idea of telling a story with a piece. And that's always been kind of my focus with Grimdark, is how can I portray more information, more story than just this finished miniature? And that's such an important part of Grimdark, is yes, you're painting, and yes, there's Grimdark painting techniques, but unless you are actively trying to tell a story and trying to put the viewer, the person who's looking at your miniature, unless you're trying to put that viewer in a way to really see what you're trying to portray, I think you're kind of missing the point of Grimdark. And so being able to tell a story, being able to create this atmosphere and this realism with that story is such a tremendous part of the setup and the conceptualization phase of Grimdark painting. Another really important part is focusing again on immersion. So how much does your piece really feel like it's a part of the environment? From your viewer's perspective, can they feel the environment? Are they mentally now immersed in this place that you've placed your miniature? Can they feel this world? Are they thinking now about what else is happening on there? That is immersion. And really, the biggest thing at the end of it is always ask yourself, if I pulled this single instance, right? The base, the miniature, if that's a part of this planet, the world, the space, the swamp, whatever, wherever these miniatures take place, if I could just cut out the earth, the planet around it, and just lift the entire thing out, would this single snapshot tell the story? Would that single thing tell the story that I'm trying to tell? And if not, you need to continue to remain in the conceptualization phase. You need to continue to figure out how to truly feel the Grimdark. What is it, and how can you portray it? And that's what Grimdark is to me. But most importantly, we need to know what is not Grimdark. Now that we have, at least some understanding of what it is, according to me, according to my friends, according to the basic definition on the internet, we now need to contrast that with what is not Grimdark. Well, I can only think of one place to start. Games Workshop box art. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only war and clean Marines for some reason. Now, why the fuck would this guy be clean? Why would this guy have zero impact from his environment on it? This is not immersive. This does not tell a story whatsoever. This guy is just running, and that's it. There's no evidence of this person having ever been in any sort of a war. There's no scratches. There's no evidence of this smoke bomb even impacting his armor. There's no evidence of smoke anywhere near this person. There's no scratches. There's nothing. This is a perfect example of what is not Grimdark. This could not be farther from Grimdark, in fact. Nothing about this is Grimdark. And the fact that the tagline of Games Workshop, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only war, is tremendously hilarious. How can you possibly advertise your grim dark setting and this is the miniatures that we see? GG. Actually, it's really funny. It's really funny marketing. I don't know. It's hilarious to me. Actually, it actually does make me laugh. So this is not Grimdark. This is about as far as you can get from it. So when you're thinking about painting Grimdark, just pull up box art. Do the opposite of that. Do the opposite. When we're thinking about what is not Grimdark, it's deeper. It goes more down the rabbit hole. But very simply, it's not Games Workshop box art. That is typically the greatest place to look for examples that are not Grimdark. It's just not. There's nothing Grimdark about it. So typically we see very, very specific things that I would say are not Grimdark. Excessive edge highlighting. Step one. This is not at all a representation of the Grimdark world. In fact, lighting doesn't really work like that. It's actually only every edge is highlighted in an effort to market the models and sell them because they look better on the tabletop or they look better in photography. The point of edge highlights is to show off details, not to tell a story. And so you see heavy metal box art traditionally is every single detail is edge highlighted, and that's in an effort to show off all the details to sell the miniatures. So excessive edge highlights are not Grimdark. I sometimes do some basic edge highlighting on my miniatures, but I only do that to cut hard edges and pop a couple of very specific details and edges on the model. But I also go back in and weather those up a little bit so they're not just a very clean edge highlight. And we could talk a little bit more about that. You typically also see oversaturated colors, colors that are too bright, too bold, that don't really make a ton of sense. Oversaturated colors are, again, another telltale sign of things that aren't necessarily Grimdark. Cell shading and comic style, not Grimdark. They don't portray the realism. You could do some pieces, and I have seen some pieces. There is exceptions to this, trust me. But typically speaking, cell shading and comic style painted miniatures are rarely Grimdark. There's some exceptions to this when you think about pieces that exist as a diorama. I would say are more typically exceptions to this, but single instances of miniatures, cell shading, comic style, no, not Grimdark. You also see a lack of immersion in the environment, right? So when we think back to the previous picture of that person, there's no evidence of him whatsoever existing in that environment. There's no soot, there's no dirt, there's no chips, there's no evidence whatsoever that that miniature has been in that environment for more than 1 second. And that lack of immersion is not Grimdark. It doesn't tell the story. There's also generally no attention to texture. You don't see things like chips and scratches and pits and deep understanding of texture and how minis and the environment can interact with those textures. You just see smooth surfaces. And then you typically also see horribly cliche color combinations. For example, ultramarines with yellow trim and previously red painted guns, and thank God they've moved into black guns. But man, you see a lot of cliche color combinations. Very cliche. Think sports teams, for example. These are the color combos that you start to see. And now it is time to learn how to paint Grimdark and impress everyone. Grimdark is hype. People like looking at it. It's wonderful for photography, it's wonderful for content, and it's liberating as a painter. So how can you paint it and impress everybody? Well, first you got to get inspired. But don't look for inspiration where you think you should. Typically, Grimdark inspiration comes from places like fan art and things like that. Codex art. These are the places that is amazing to get inspired by Grimdark because it makes you think outside of the box. One of the most amazing things about Grimdark is it forces you to leave this concept, this shelter of box art painting style, where you say, I picked up this box of miniatures. On the back, it says I need these 4 colors. So I'm going to pick up those 4 colors. I'm going to go home and paint it, and it's going to look just like that. The reality is it's not. It's not going to look just like that. It's not really going to look that good compared to the box art, because box art, these guys know more things than you think that they do. And they're some of the best artists in the world, period. And it's a lie. The box art is a lie. You can't paint to look like that. You could get kind of close, probably decently close if you're a fantastic painter, but that's not how it works at all. And I would highly encourage you to start to move your brain away from looking at the back of a box and saying, I want to paint like this, and start looking at 2D art and thinking, what colors are these? How can I get colors similar to this? What is it about this piece that is so interesting to look at? And start to go that direction. That is a much better place to spend time learning and thinking about art than to try to replicate every single detail off the back of a box. It's mentally exhausting and it's frustrating. It creates very impossible barriers that you really just can't climb because they don't tell you all the techniques they use. They don't tell you or teach you that they're using volumetric lighting. They don't talk about that. And these are the problems with box art. For other inspiration, just continue to cruise all of your old codexes. The old codex art is literally amazing for Grimdark. It's amazing for conversions. It's amazing for inspiration. It's amazing for just feeling what those miniatures are going to be about. It's a great place to begin. And you could probably pick up some old codexes for pretty cheap. Really cheap, depending on where you get them. As long as they're not some crazy collector's edition, you'll be surprised at how cheap old codexes can go for. It's a fantastic place to start. Other places, listen, I don't like to do it either. I get it. But actually go outside. Go experience the world. Go check it out. Actually go outside. Go out in the world. Actually experience it. Go out there and do it. Actually go outside. I get it. I like to just lurk. I like to just spend time chilling. But there's a lot of good inspiration. You can learn a lot about what Grimdark is supposed to look like, the way the environment impacts things based on going outside. You learn a lot. You learn a ton, actually. You're going to want to actually spend some time looking into converting your minis to set the tone for the paint scheme. That's another great place to get inspired, is spending time setting the canvas, right? If you want to paint Grimdark miniatures, you need a Grimdark model from the start. In a lot of ways you do. And some models right out of the gate are perfect. Some of them are, but some of them need some tweaks. And setting the canvas for your art with a nice conversion, even subtle changes, can really help you become inspired to start painting Grimdark. Subtle changes to it, whether maybe you want to add some battle damage on your guy. Maybe you want to add some chipping, some scratches. Converting is a fantastic way to start to get your brain thinking about what's next. It's a great place to start. And finally, you can, you guys have all heard my rant I don't necessarily highly recommend going out, looking at other people's miniatures and saying, I want to do that, and then doing it. I think it's mentally a bad thing to do. I think it's going to put you in a mental spiral that's hard to come out of as an artist at times, because you're constantly saying, how come I'm not as good as this? Why doesn't my piece look like this piece? It's a bad artist spiral to be in. So I generally don't actually recommend by any means looking at other miniatures. However, I think that there is some value in looking at Blanchitsu style miniatures as a good reference point to begin your journey into Grimdark. If you're not familiar with Blanchitsu is a very stylized type of miniature painting that comes from looking at the fantasy art from John Blanche of the setting of 40K. And a lot of painters have taken it upon themselves to make conversions that, are head nods to his work. And then they take it a step further by painting it in his style, right? They want it to look and pay tribute to his two-dimensional art. And that's what the style came from. And there is a difference between Blanchitsu and Grimdark. There is. But I would say Blanchitsu lives inside of Grimdark. You know what I mean? Blanchitsu is a style, right? It's like a flavor. It's a type of Grimdark. But it's a great place to get some initial reference points. And again, I don't recommend spending all day just cruising through Instagram and looking at every single piece that's ever been painted in Grimdark style and trying to replicate it. But I think that in your initial journey into Grimdark, you can find some value in looking at other people's models and pieces and getting at least an additional kind of like, hey, this is, my initial idea on how this works. And it's a good launch off place. It is. Just don't get trapped in trying to perfectly replicate what you are seeing, because it is mentally exhausting and a bad place to live in mentally. So be smart about what you look at, understand the limitations of yourself as an artist, and don't overthink or spend too much time getting lost in the idea that you are going to try to replicate somebody else's work, because it's hard. Unless you're a very, very skilled artist, unless you really know what you're doing, it can be very mentally taxing and it can disappoint you. And I just don't want you guys to go down that rabbit hole, because it sucks. So be careful when you look at other miniatures, but there is some great inspiration in other miniatures. So now you're hella stoked, bruh. Let's paint. Duh. Grimdark painting basics. So let's talk a little bit about some of the techniques that you're going to need to get familiar with and learn how to use. The most important one, in my opinion, is learning reduction techniques using streaking grime and enamel washes. So what is a reduction technique? A reduction technique is using a paint and then reducing it back off of the model, reducing how much of it exists. Streaking grime and enamel washes, oil washes also, are all, they're all thinned with white spirits, for example. So if you apply streaking grime, enamel washes, oil washes to a miniature, you can come back in with white spirits, mineral spirits, etc., and reduce the amount of it on the model by simply applying the white spirits to what is already on there. It thins it, it dissolves it, and you can use a Q-tip to just wick it up and pull it off of the model. That is reduction. You're reducing the paint on there. It is a reduction technique. Learning reduction techniques is one of the most important first steps into Grimdark. It allows you to get effective, good weathering, additional types of color variation, and all sorts of stuff, literally with sometimes just one coat. It's an amazingly powerful tool. Some other things to learn for weathering: chipping, pigments, rust, and environment effects. These are clutch, right? You're going to get some good quick weathering from streaking grime, and oils, enamel washes are good, quick, efficient weathering. They're fantastic. But you're going to need to know other stuff. You need other tricks up your sleeve in order to actually be able to pull off weathering properly. So there's a few ways to approach chipping. I personally prefer the sponge. I think it's quick, it's effective. If that's not enough for you, you can go in and refine it with a brush. Or you could do all of your chipping up front with a paintbrush. It's effective, but it takes a long time compared to a sponge. A sponge is much faster, but it's less effective. And that's the trade-off between the two. Sponge, 80-20. Paintbrush, 20-80. You know what I mean? You're spending like 80% of your time to get a good effect. Sponge, you're spending 20% of your time to get a decently fast, honestly, pretty good effect. So sponge weathering is where I do all of my weathering. I like it. I think it's value added. It's quick. It's easy. Huge fan of sponge weathering. However, there's amazing brush weathering people in the world, and it actually does look better. It's just the time investment is insane. It's insane. The time investment from sponge to brush is absolutely mental. So it's up to you which road you want to go down, but know that there's a dramatic time difference between the two. You know, there's other chipping techniques too. There's actual chipping medium. I've tried it. I don't love it. I got to say that. I will tell you the one thing that it does do compared to the other things is it does add an actual texture. You're getting layers of paint that are actually chipping and coming apart. And it does add some nice texture. It's just, it's a technique that I don't necessarily love. I've tried it. I don't personally use it or love it. There's other things too. There's salt chipping, if you're not familiar with that, where you basically lay down some paint, sprinkle on a bunch of salt, keep laying down your base coats on the top of that, and then you just start to brush off all the salt with a toothbrush. And then when those fall off, it appears as chipping because it blocked the paint. I don't love that technique. Again, it works, but I don't love it. For me, weathering is at its fastest with a sponge and at its best with a brush. And that's the decision you guys need to make when you're learning weathering. Weathering with pigments is pretty easy. For the most part, you're really just stippling on pigments and using a sealer or some sort of a fixer to get them to adhere to the model. You can use pigments to add color variations to chipping, to the feet to look like dust. You could literally paint your whole base with just pigments. There's tons of different stuff you could do with it. Pigments, truly the creativity, the sky's the limit with them. They're messy. They're very messy, but they're a great tool to have up your sleeve for weathering. And then finally, rust and environmental effects. You know, there's a ton of different ways to approach rust. There's a ton of different ways to approach it. Truly, like it's insane. But it comes down to, again, what are you most comfortable with, right? Do you want to put on some enamel rust and streak it down? You know, do you want to add some drips and some rust streaks? Do you want to just maybe use a sponge to add what looks like rust quickly? Do you want to use a brush to go in and add some rust pits into your chips that you did with a sponge? There's tons of different ways to approach rusting a model. And it's the same thing with environmental effects, right? Like there's, you know, the rust works because it's exposed to the environment. And so rust is one of those things that helps show off that this model has been a part of the environment. It's been exposed to the elements, and as a result, there's now rust. And it's a great, great technique to get behind and understand. Another really important technique is OSL. Both atmosphere and environmental OSL are very important, but just generally understanding high quality OSL and how to quickly do it on things like eyes, plasma, power weapons, anything like that adds that little bit of a pop that sometimes we see lacking from Grimdark pieces. Grimdark pieces can easily become too desaturated, too muted, too quiet looking on the table. And OSL can really help re-elevate what you lose when you start doing some Grimdark, because you do lose some color saturation. Just with some of these techniques, you will lose the vibrancy of your model to a degree. But that's something that we can plan for early, and we can counteract with other techniques like OSL. It's crazy how much a little tiny impact something like just glowing eyes makes. And when you think about the storytelling, the immersion of Grimdark, the glowing eyes is terrifying. Think about walking down a corridor and you don't know what's coming at you. You think it might be a space marine, but all you see are these two glowing eyes. And you think, is this a good guy or is this a chaos space marine? Which actually is, I guess, actually, now I say that, they're technically the good guys too. So, or maybe the only good guy, I don't know. Either way, OSL helps to add to this immersion. It helps add into the storytelling that things are glowing and warm and different and unique. And that's something that can really help up the quality of your miniatures. The techniques are there. So it's important to understand some basic OSL. You're also going to want to look and learn immersive basing. How do you make more elaborate bases? How do you make them more interesting, more dynamic? And how, again, do you make your miniature feel like it's a part of the base? Immersive basing, up your basing game, is so important to Grimdark. Beautiful bases, next level bases, S tier bases, like all this stuff is typical things that you see in the Grimdark scene because it goes hand in hand with the storytelling piece of Grimdark. We also see a lot of the techniques involved are using muted and desaturated color palettes. So having a very good technical understanding of how muted colors work, how desaturated colors work, and how to use that to your advantage. Desaturated colors is a great way to take attention off of a part of the model, knowing that you want to add attention to another part. So if I'm going to desaturate my model knowing I want glowing eyes, well, I've just set the tone for that by desaturating the entire model. Color modulation and filtering. Huge, especially filtering. Filtering colors, especially with enamels, is wonderful. Super fast way to filter all your colors. Filtering your colors is going to bring them all together. It's the idea that you could take one color, a different color, and almost unify them with an enamel wash, right? Or else you take, a different color and filter it and push it in a different direction. You know what I mean? Like if you want to base coat your miniature white, zenithal highlighting, for example, and then you tint the whole thing with green, well, you're filtering the color over that white. You're adding different colors into it by exploiting the transparency of painting, which we will talk about a lot more in the coming weeks. Trust me. I'm a huge fan of exploiting the transparency of paints. It's the most important thing to understand why you're painting with acrylics, is that they're fascinatingly transparent when you use them right. Color modulation, changing the colors that exist with washes, dry brushing, glazing, etc., and actually filtering colors using the transparency of paints is very, very important. Then other techniques that you see quite often that you got to start to understand is blood, slime, and other gross effects. And there's a lot of ways to do these things. Like there's a million ways to apply blood to a miniature, right? Are you somebody that just takes your entire paintbrush in, dabs it, and just smears it on the model? Maybe you are. Are you somebody that takes a paintbrush, dibs it in your blood technical paint, and then uses an airbrush to splatter it off of the brush on the model? Maybe you do that too. Maybe you take your paintbrush and you dip it in there and you flick the bristles at the model. Maybe use a toothbrush. There's literally a million ways to apply blood. There's so many of them. And this is just one example of understanding the techniques of these things. So you need to understand some basic techniques of applying some of these technical effects. Blood, slime, gross effects is an important part of Grimdark to a degree. But with these techniques, I would always caution you less is more. Use a lot less blood than you think you should when you use blood splattering techniques. It should be about the third, fourth, maybe even fifth thing somebody notices when they look at your model. They should look at your model and say, this is dope. And then they go, oh, that blood splatter's sick. Later, you don't want it to be the primary focus of your model, but you want it to be there. And these are just really some of the basic techniques that I think are important to latch onto and understand when painting Grimdark. Tools. Not all of these are required, but I will tell you that these are helpful. These help. Big time. I'm a huge proponent of airbrushing. I think everybody should own at least one. I think that there's a significant misunderstanding about the cost of entry to airbrushing, both financially, space-wise, health-wise, all of these things. There's a significant misunderstanding about how complicated airbrushing really is. So if at all possible, if you're able to save up financially to get one, if you have any sort of space whatsoever to airbrush on, I highly recommend you get into it. Airbrushing is an absolutely incredible tool. You could do all of Grimdark painting without one, trust me. But it is so much more efficient to do it with one. And efficiency is very important when it comes to Grimdark because you will be doing things that you've never done before. There's painting techniques, there's styles, there's things that you'll be doing that you've never done. And now you have to factor in that time of a technique that you've never done when you're painting. Airbrushes will help you speed up your painting dramatically. So I run a 4 airbrush rig. Is that excessive? Yes, it is. But I would recommend 2 airbrushes always. One for your grime and your oils, one for everything else. Ideally, another airbrush for primer. Primer is like your airbrush's arch nemesis. Truly brutal stuff. So be careful with primer. Long term, it will fuck up your airbrush. Just straight up, it will. But I highly recommend getting into it if at all possible. You're going to use your airbrush to help you with OSL. Bingo, bango, bongo, right off the bat. OSL is so good through an airbrush. And going back to some of these previous points, you need some of those additional pieces to raise general interest to your Grimdark piece. You lose a lot of colors when you paint in Grimdark. A lot of stuff gets muted, a lot of stuff gets desaturated, but you can bring it all back up to the surface with quick, effective OSL. Airbrush is the easiest, most effective way to do OSL, flat out. Sure, can you do it with glazing? Yeah. Can you do it dry brushing? Yeah. Can you get amazing looking OSL with an airbrush in fractions of the time of both of those? Definitely. And that's why OSL with an airbrush is so OP. It's so important to, if you have an airbrush, start exploring OSL. You know, the obvious thing that you do with an airbrush is smooth gradients and colors on your base coats. You really want an amazing series of gradients when you're painting in Grimdark, because your color filters, right? Your enamel washes, your unifying wash, right? Covering an entire miniature with an enamel wash at the end of your painting is going to help add some drama to those gradients that you've laid in. Otherwise, you just get the streak and grime right over the top of your base color, which is fine. It still looks good, but having a gradient, I could tell you, streak and grime loves gradients. It loves it. It loves latching onto it, making them more dramatic, adding color variations. Gradients and streak and grimes and enamel washes, oil washes are like best friends. They love each other. And color gradients is one of those things that's a really good way to add realism to your miniature. Colors don't appear flat. You don't look at a car and it's the exact same color red over the whole thing. You'd have different color reflections in it. You know, some of it's darker, some of it's brighter. And that's just the way color gradients work. And it's very important to have an understanding of how to apply color gradients, where points of reflection would be, where's brighter, where's darker. Very, very, very important step of Grimdark is understanding color gradients and, in my opinion, applying them with an airbrush. It's fast, it's effective. Sure, you could do it with contrast paints, right? You could lay down a zenithal highlight, get some great gradients with contrast. That's fine, still takes longer. You could be crazy and glaze those in. That takes really long. You could dry brush them in, that looks fine. But having the right tool for the job is super important with Grimdark. And I will continue to tell you, an airbrush is one of those things that just makes this entire style so much easier. Applying the enamels and the oil washes through an airbrush, also very OP. Sure, you could hand brush it all on. You can absolutely do that. You could totally do that. Trust me, I've seen people do it. It works, it's great. But it's better with an airbrush. It's smoother, it's a thinner coat. It's more universally applied. It's just better overall. Better overall. Next tool that you got to learn, white and mineral spirits. How to use them, when to use them, where to use them. Well, it depends on where you live, what you have access to. White spirits, mineral spirits, it's different, right? It's a harsh chemical. You got to understand what they are, how to use them, and where you live dictates what you get. Do you get white spirits there? Do you get mineral spirits there? The bottom line is they're enamel oil paint thinners. So once you're basically your enamel wash is on your miniature, you're going to use white spirits and mineral spirits to clean it up, to wick away the excess from areas that you don't want it to be. It's a tool that you got to get and you got to get familiar with. Out of all the tools that you're like, yeah, I don't know if I need this stuff. You have to have white spirits and mineral spirits if you're painting with enamels or oils. You have to have these things. White spirits and mineral spirits is not an optional tool if you want to go deep into this style. It's not. Some of these other stuff, sure. White mineral spirits is not. You need this. It's very important. Trust me. It is the way that we remove. It's a part of the reduction technique that we use. Next, we're going to want files and Dremels for physical weathering if that's what you're into. If your thing is actually adding physical battle damage to your model, well, you're going to need some tools for that. So files and Dremels to actually add those chips, the pits, the bullet ricochets, all that stuff is done with files and Dremels. I'm a huge fan of using sponges for chipping. So I got to have a bunch of sponges on deck. I use literally the pluck foam from my army carry cases, right? I have knockoff Pelican cases from Harbor Freight. They come loaded with a shit ton of pluck foam. Literally, you buy one army carry case, you're pretty much set for life. You can weather 1,000,000 armies from now on. You're good. You have enough sponges. You did it. Congratulations. You now have all the sponges. You're going to need tweezers to hold those sponges. So I use reverse action so I don't have to think about squeezing it and holding it with my fingers. I just tear off a piece of sponge, bloop, throw that in there. Now that's in my tweezers. Now it's ready to go. And then also you're going to need Q-tips. You could also use makeup sponges for this. There's tons of different ways that you could use different sponge type of products to remove the enamels and the oil spirits, but I like Q-tips. There's a strong argument that Q-tips are a problem because they can leave the hairs of the Q-tips, the little fibers stay behind. But listen, as soon as you see your Q-tips start to fall apart, just throw it away. Get the next Q-tip. Next Q-tip. Next Q-tip. They cost fractions of pennies. It's not like you're going bankrupt by going through all your Q-tips. Makeup sponges are a good alternative, but in my opinion, they remove too much enamel, too much oil. They're too effective. They soak up too much. So I've done tons of testing, and I can tell you confidently I prefer Q-tips over anything else. Next, paints. Paints. Again, some of these are mandatory, some of them are not. But streak and grime. Some sort of a streak and grime, in my opinion, is mandatory to Grimdark painting. Absolutely. You have to have some sort of streak and grime or enamel wash. I think it's the most value added. The fastest way to Grimdark is with an enamel wash, right? And it's effective too. It's so effective. It looks beautiful. It creates these amazing weathering patterns, these amazing color variations, these unifying washes, color filtering. It's just like the one-stop shop. It's totally a cheat code. It is insane. It is insane. I cannot imagine painting Grimdark without streak and grime. It's possible, but I cannot imagine doing it in any sort of a way that even acknowledges efficiency or time. Streak and grime is so important to painting in Grimdark. I highly recommend you check out MIG because AK is a bunch of morons, a bunch of insensitive pieces of shit, to be honest. So I would highly recommend you spend time looking into MIG over AK. If you want to know more about that, literally just Google AK's marketing. There's tons of people very pissed off about them. Not a great company. Don't recommend them. MIG, I have MIG in the ammo right now. I've never used it, and I can highly recommend it over AK based solely on AK's marketing choices. AK's products have worked fine for me in the past, but I'm done with it. I'm moving on. I'm over them. That's it. You're going to need a really tacky primer. Currently, I use Stynylrez. That's what I use. Stynylrez is very tacky. Tacky is very important. Reduction techniques can sometimes include physical abrasion, right? You're rubbing Q-tips on stuff that's painted. If it gets underneath it, right? If the paint gets underneath, sometimes that physical abrasion can lift off all of the paint, including the primer, right? So this is why you need a very tacky primer to start with. Something that really sticks to the model, that, you know, the white spirits, all that stuff is not going to get underneath. And even if somehow it does, it doesn't care. It's not going anywhere. Next, you really need a nice muted paint range. I use Procryl. I love the idea of using nice muted desaturated colors right out of the gate. I think it just makes your job easier. You don't have to think about how am I going to desaturate and mute my color palette. Just start with a muted color palette. What are you thinking? There's two ways to do this, in my opinion. I use Procryl, and if you want to use Procryl too, use code the sauce at checkout. It's the best paint in the game. Definitely check it out. If you're not into Procryl, I get it. I get it. Well, I don't get it. I don't get it. I need to take that back. I don't understand why you would not use that. But if you don't have access to it, or you're curious about other ranges, Vallejo Model Air is fantastic. Fantastic for desaturated, almost like scale model, you know, tip of the cap to like historic wargaming style of painting. A lot of desaturated, amazing color tones in their model range. So check that out. Great stuff. I've got a bunch in the rack next to me. And then you're also going to want a quick coverage paint for details. I use contrast paints. I understand that there's other paints around. There's other paints that exist that do similar things. I know Scale 75 has got their own version of contrast paints. But you need a paint that can cover details effectively, very fast. Very, very fast. And when I say cover very fast, I don't mean literally just put paint on it. I mean, how can we get shading and highlighting and coverage in basically one coat? Because that's what you need. You don't want to spend too much time on your details in Grimdark. You just want them to exist and you want to move on. And that's the Grimdark mentality is, yes, this detail exists, but unless it's a very important detail to me, I just need it covered. I just need it painted. Not fantastic. I don't need to spend all this time on this single instance of a detail. I just need it painted. And that's it. That's a big part of the Grimdark mentality is how important is this? Not that important to the final image, not that important to the final product that I see in my brain. All right, let's move on. That's what detail paints, like contrast paints, help you do, is knock out your details so fast. So now that we know some of the tools, the paints, the tricks of the trade, what's Grimdark, what's not, are you guys ready to learn how to paint Grimdark? It's this easy. This is exactly how I paint Grimdark. It's literally this easy. It's this many steps. It is so easy, but it comes down to latching onto these techniques and experimenting with them for yourselves. But I can tell you wholeheartedly, I've painted many thousands of points of models. I've painted hundreds and hundreds of models in this style. And this is my dulled down, quick, effective, dirty, efficient version of how to paint Grimdark. It is literally this easy. So first step, focus on quality initial color gradients with an airbrush as much as possible. An airbrush will help you get these color gradients locked in quick and effective. And that's what you need. Grimdark, let's get this done. Let's move on. Let's get this done. Let's move on. But I will tell you a word of caution. You need to overcommit to color saturation early in the game. Now, I know I was just talking about the value of using desaturated paints and using a muted color palette, but you need to start to learn, and you will learn, what happens to paints when you wash them with enamels, when you wash them with oils. It dulls down their color saturation a lot. So in your initial phases of airbrushing, when you're putting in your initial color gradients, consider growing brighter than you think that you should. If you think your highlights should be at like a 9, they need to actually be at like an 11. Like they need to be higher than you think they will, because enamel paints and overall enamel wash will kill your color saturation, which is fine as long as you plan for it. Depending on the order of operations, this is the part of where I would add weathering. So if I'm painting a Space Marine, for example, I have now added my color gradients over the whole miniature. I now will go in and start doing weathering here. That's my very next step, initial weathering. So I'm going to come in with a sponge. I'm going to start doing my sponge chipping all over the armor panels that I've just done. And the reason that I do that next is because if I go in and I do, like, let's say the shoulder trim, if I paint the shoulder trim a metallic color, I paint the Aquila a metallic color. Well, in my mind, that shoulder trim and that Aquila actually weather differently than the armor panels next to it. So I want to focus on the armor panel weathering before I do any other details, right? That should be your focus on your color gradient. What are the largest panels on this model? What's the largest point of interest? Is it, you know, maybe it's a giant demon and it's the skin tones, but most of 40K, your main focus is going to be the armor panels. So you're going to dig into that and start working on your armor panels. Next, you're going to start to weather them, right? And then we're going to move into all those details. Again, I really prefer sponge weathering for your initial weathering because of the return on your investment for time. It's extremely efficient. It is extremely efficient compared to brush weathering. Extremely efficient. However, you can always come back in and add more detail. If you want to do the brush weathering thing, more power to you, do it. If you want to do brush weathering from the start, do it. If you want to do chipping medium, do it. But this is the part where you would do it. This is the order. This is step 2. Start the weathering on your armor panels. Once the basic armor and skin tones are complete, you're going to start focusing on color blocking the rest of the colors on the rest of the mini. You're color blocking out the whole thing. It's very easy. The way that I do it is like, hey, is this metal? Cool. Now it's metal. Paint metal on it. Is this not metal? Cool. It's going to get hit with contrast paint. So block all the details that are not metal with Pro Acryl White. Pro Acryl White is the best white in the game. It covers everything in one coat. It's insane. It's totally a cheat code. It's totally a cheat code. You can cover like any color in one coat of Pro Acryl White. And as long as you know that you're hitting it with contrast paint ever, it doesn't need to be the most like perfectly smooth opaque white. It's damn close, I'll tell you that. It's very close. It's really good. It's an amazing paint. But this is the color blocking phase. Once that dries, then you'll come back in and use your contrasts on it, right? So now you're color blocked. Your miniature is color blocked. That is the most important thing about painting Grimdark. Color block your miniature. It's not that hard when you think about it like that. There's so many technical steps that we've just skipped. We're not sitting there. We're not doing like forcing in all these like crazy edge highlights and spending all this additional time on, oh, I need to shade this leather pouch and then do edge highlights and scratches on it. Like, no, you don't. You just need to color block it. You can do that stuff. Trust me, but you don't have to. And then we get to the magic phase, right? Streak and grime. We've got this color blocked. Now we're going to come in ideally with an airbrush and apply a very thin coat or thick, or somewhere in the middle, whatever you want to do, but start thin when you're learning this. Trust me, start thin. You can always ramp it up or down. But then you're going to come in, thin coat, streak and grime all over everything you've just done. It is now a unifying wash, and it's terrifying. You've just spent 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour painting this model, and now your thought is, it's time to cover this thing in streaking grime. What the hell is that? It's brave painting. This is crazy shit. The first time you ever do it, you will literally have like a mini heart attack. You're like, I hope this works. And it does. You're relying on chemicals. You're relying on chemicals with a proven interaction to work. And they do. Every time, unless you've screwed something up, they will work. That's the next step. We've literally now done 4 steps. Painting Grimdark is a series of understanding the steps. It's a series of practicing and thinking through what matters, what doesn't. What are the techniques? What are the tools? What are the paints? And then you just have to do a couple of simple steps and you're there. As soon as the streaking grime appears to be dry, you start going in with this reduction technique that we've talked about. You come in with a Q-tip loaded with white spirits. You literally start to just soak it up a little bit. Soak it up a little bit. I always say let it look dry to the touch. Enamels can be worked on for hours later. Hours, like days. Days if you want to. I don't recommend it, but my ideal working time for enamel is dry to the touch, meaning if you picked it up, would your fingers be covered in grime? If not, it is now ready for removal. And that's a visual thing, right? If it looks shiny and wet, let it sit for another like minute or two. It's not a big deal. And again, this is why I recommend batch painting. You know what I mean? You could get done with airbrush like 5 models. By the time you get done with the 5th one, trust me, that first one's probably ready for removal. So then you get into your reduction techniques. After that, and everything's reduced, you got your streaking grime pulled off, you've got what you want left, which you will see a lot more of this technique in action in the coming weeks on these videos. But once that's now removed, you come back in and you can start to add any additional detail work. Now, this is up to you. You can either do this stuff before the streaking grime, right? If you have, again, another example, Space Marine, no helmet. Do you want the streaking grime on that flesh or do you not? Totally up to you. Totally up to you. I would recommend no. So this is where you would come in and you paint that whole face. You either are crazy and you go through and you do it all one step at a time. You paint it all, you know, some sort of a flesh tone. You build up your highlights, whatever. You can do that. It takes forever. Or you come in, paint the whole face like pearl acryl white, slap on some contrast paint over it, some flesh contrast, build up a couple quick highlights, drop in some eyes. Your face is done. So you're going to want to focus on any additional detail work that was left out from your grime phase. If you're like, hey, I don't think that this human flesh would weather the same way as armor, you're probably right. This is the part where you would come back in and do that. And finally, the last step, the very last thing you should do, whether it's Grimdark or any other painting style, OSL. OSL is always the last thing. Always the last thing, because glow happens on top of everything else. If I'm holding a plasma gun, it doesn't matter if I'm in clean armor or chipped armor or no armor, it's going to reflect on me. The armor has no impact on the reflection. The reflection has an impact on everything else. And that's it. Truly, these are the steps. This is it. I've done this so many times. I've painted so many armies in this style. I've painted so many miniatures in this style. I've done handfuls of commissions. I've painted probably like 5,000 to 10,000 points of models in this exact style. And this is it. These are the steps, as simple and dumbed down as I could possibly make it. Sure, is each one of these steps a little bit more complicated than this? Yeah. But we're going to do tutorials over all the Space Marine founding chapters to cover these steps in more detail in the coming weeks. But this is it. This is as simple as it is. It's these steps. That's all there is to it. Easy. It's easy peasy. That is Grimdark in a nutshell. These are the steps. This is what matters. GG. Seriously, it's that easy. I think it's important to talk about the pros and the cons. There's a lot more pros and cons, I'll tell you that. You know, the first thing that I love about Grimdark is it's very freeform and forgiving. It's very freeform. It's all about the experience. It's all about your interpretation of the art. It's all about your interpretation of the world that they live in. And it's amazing. It's a super great way to express yourself as an artist, to get to know the artist within, to find your own style if you want. If you're trapped and you're like, I don't know what my style is, try Grimdark. And even if it's not Grimdark, it's going to show you some stuff that you have to rely on. There's things that are a part of your painting agenda that you might use as a crutch, and you'll probably find that out when you start painting in Grimdark. And that's fine. Totally fine. It's also shockingly fast when done right. Trust me, it is a crazy, crazy fast way to paint. Crazy fast. If you do it right, if you know the tools, if you know how to get away with speed painting in a way that looks great, Grimdark. Grimdark is fast. Very high visual impact for photos. Grimdark looks amazing. Amazing when photographed properly. Can 10 out of 10 confirm that? Go to my Instagram for any sort of proof on that. Go to anybody's Instagram who does Grimdark stuff. You're going to see some amazing stuff. And more importantly, you're going to see some crazy follow numbers likely. Grimdark content is good. As a content creator, it's good. It's a good trick up your sleeve. Making Grimdark art, good trick up your sleeve. It has very high visual impact, especially when you photograph it in creative ways, in immersive ways, against terrain, all this sort of stuff. It looks amazing. I think it's very important to highlight again how important mentally it is for painters to not compare themselves to box art. Box art is a lie. It's a joke. It's not attainable. I understand why they market it that way. It's just bad for painters' brains. Mentally exhausting. It's a bad black hole to go down as an artist, in my opinion. And I think Grimdark is the exact opposite of box art. And because of that, I think it's wonderful for your painting mentally. I think it's going to help you reevaluate yourself as an artist. Maybe find some new fun you haven't fun in a long time. It's a great way to get reinvigorated about something that maybe you've been mentally drained about. You know, it also breaks the mold of expected painting styles. There's going to be stuff that you're going to see in Grimdark that you're like, what is that? Why would you use this color combination? And they're more creative color combos. It's more creative use of color theory, but it breaks out of what people expect to see. And that goes back up a couple bullet points. Very high visual impact, right? It's more interesting. Grimdark done right is very thought-provoking when you look at it. You're like, what is this? And that's kind of what you want to go for. And it's breaking out. Some of that comes from people not expecting to see what they see. It destroys faux barriers in place and opens creative doors not seen in other styles. In a lot of ways, there's things that are very unique to Grimdark painting. There's things that you don't see other styles focusing on, you know? There is no Games Workshop tutorial on how to weather your mini effectively. Not to my knowledge. And lastly, it makes Duncan cry. I don't actually know if it does or not, but I just thought that was a funny bit to add in there. So it's in there. Makes Duncan cry. Actually, I could see Duncan maybe being into some Grimdark stuff. I could see it actually. But some of these painting styles would probably make him cry. Some of the stuff that he sees us doing, he'd be like, oh my God, what? What are you doing? What? I don't know. That just makes me happy. Going to sleep at night thinking that somebody out there is watching somebody paint Grimdark and they're like, what the fuck are you doing? Whether it's Duncan or not. That makes me sleep good at night. You know, at the end of the day, the cons list is short. I'll tell you. You know, the biggest roadblock to Grimdark painting is the acquisition of the tools. It's a very product-centric, tool-centric series. It is. You have to have certain tools. You have to be able to have access to certain paints, certain chemicals to be able to pull this off. You just do. And that's a roadblock. I get it. That's a barrier. But if you're able to overcome that, you're good to go. You can power through it. That is definitely a barrier though. A barrier to entry. Absolutely. Like you might literally have to spend money on stuff that you don't own, which I understand is a barrier to entry. So that is a con. There is literally a barrier to entry for Grimdark. There is a wall there. And if you want to paint Grimdark, you got to get over it. That's step one. Some paints and chemicals used are very harsh. True. Enamels, white spirits, mineral spirits. Shit's not great for you. Very harsh. Very harsh. You're going to get this comment all the time now. Somebody's always going to say, hey, it looks like he's got shit on them. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, all the time. You're going to get that all the time. You'll get that regularly. Somebody will be like, ha, hey, your models look like they got shit on their face, man. Hey, man. Ha 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 ha. Have you ever seen that joke before? Ha ha ha. It looks like it's got poop on it. Ha ha. Yeah, seriously. You're going to get that all the time. So you guys start preparing for that now. I can tell you that's coming. That's coming. And seriously, the cons list is so minimal. Honestly, I almost didn't make this slide. Like, that's it. I can't think of anything else about it. There's really no other cons. There is not. It's extremely minimal. I think that the pros dramatically outweigh the cons to this style. I really don't see much to it, to be honest. The cons list is like, no, I spent more time on this slide than any other slide in this presentation because I seriously was like, what is the downside of this style? Like, seriously. And yeah, there is some products you literally have to buy, and cost barrier, actual product acquisition. Sometimes hunting these products down can be hard. It's a con. The chemicals are not good for you. And the other two are a joke. Those are like, really? That's it. That's it. And so anyways, I hope this was insightful. Painting Grimdark is something that I would love everybody to get involved in. I would love all of you guys to experience Grimdark, the joys of it, and be able to mentally overcome whatever barriers you think exist in this hobby, especially in painting Grimdark. It's a lot easier than it looks. It's very product centric. You need certain products. You need to understand certain techniques. But once you have your head wrapped around the basics of it, once you especially have your head wrapped around what is Grimdark to begin with, the sky's the limit. And I really hope that this helps you start to see about it. If you want to get into Grimdark, I hope that this is now the door that's been opened, and I hope that you run with it. But it really all starts with the first step. And so anyways, I encourage you guys to get out there, take the first step, and get into Grimdark. It's completely changed the hobby for me, and it's very satisfying, extremely satisfying. I love it, and I hope you guys do too. Thanks for watching.